Genghis Khan's brutal method, how he used women to build an empire. I never thought that the most revolutionary military strategy in human history would come from a man who understood something that modern leaders still struggle to grasp, that true power isn't built through force alone, but through the strategic elevation and empowerment of those society considers powerless. When Genghis Khan conquered the largest contiguous empire in human history, he didn't just use brute force and superior tactics. He deployed a method so brutal in its effectiveness that it would reshape civilizations, yet so progressive in its foundation that it challenges everything we think we know about medieval warfare and women's roles in building empires. The story begins not with the great Khan himself, but with a decision that would echo through centuries: his revolutionary approach to women in a world where they were considered little more than property. While other conquerors collected women as trophies, Genghis Khan saw something that his contemporaries missed entirely. He recognized that women possessed strategic capabilities that, when properly channeled, could become the foundation of an empire that would span from Eastern Europe to the Pacific Ocean. But to understand the brutality of his method, we must first understand the world Genghis Khan was born into. In 12th century Mongolia, women lived at the mercy of tribal warfare, constantly vulnerable to being kidnapped, enslaved, or worse when rival tribes clashed. The steppe was a harsh place where survival depended on strength, and strength was traditionally measured by the sword and the horse. Yet even in this masculine world of warriors, women had always held certain forms of power that most men were blind to. Genghis Khan's mother, Hoelun, would become the first example of how the future emperor learned to see women not as burdens to be protected or prizes to be won, but as strategic assets to be empowered. When his father was poisoned and their family was abandoned by their tribe, it was Hoelun who kept the family alive through the brutal Mongolian winters. She taught her children to forage, to survive, to think strategically about every resource and every relationship. Watching his mother navigate impossible circumstances with intelligence, resilience, and political cunning taught young Temujin, the future Genghis Khan, that women possessed forms of strength that were invisible to most men, but absolutely essential for survival and expansion. This early lesson would later evolve into what historians would call one of the most sophisticated systems of female empowerment in the ancient world, disguised as conquest. The brutal method began to take shape when Genghis Khan started his first military campaigns. Instead of following the traditional pattern of conquest, kill the men, enslave the women, burn everything else, he implemented a strategy that was shocking in its departure from conventional warfare. When he conquered a territory, he made a radical decision. He would identify the most intelligent, capable, and influential women in the conquered society and offer them something unprecedented: power, protection, and purpose within his growing empire. This wasn't mercy or kindness in any conventional sense. It was brutal calculation. Genghis Khan had observed that women often possessed intelligence networks that men couldn't access, understood social dynamics that escaped male attention, and commanded loyalty that transcended tribal boundaries. More importantly, he realized that empowered women could become the most effective agents of cultural transformation and imperial integration. The method worked like this. When a city or tribe was conquered, Genghis Khan's generals would identify not just the military and political leaders, but the women who held informal power: the healers, the merchants, the mothers of important families, the keepers of cultural knowledge. Instead of treating these women as spoils of war, he would offer them positions of genuine authority within the Mongol administration. But here's where the brutality of the method becomes clear. These weren't acts of benevolence. They were calculated moves in a grand strategy of psychological and cultural conquest. By elevating women who had been suppressed under previous regimes, Genghis Khan created a class of grateful, capable administrators who had personal stakes in the success of Mongol rule. These women became his most effective weapons against rebellion and resistance. The psychological impact was devastating to conquered societies. When the very women who had been considered powerless under the old regime suddenly held positions of authority under Mongol rule, It sent a message that was both inspiring and terrifying. The old order was not just defeated, it was obsolete. The Mongols offered something that no other conqueror had: the possibility of advancement based on merit rather than birth. And this applied especially to those who had been most marginalized under previous systems. Consider the case of Sorkoktani, a Nestorian Christian woman who became one of the most powerful people in the Mongol Empire. She was originally from a conquered tribe, but Genghis Khan's son Tolui married her not just for political alliance, but because she demonstrated exceptional administrative and strategic capabilities. She would go on to influence imperial policy, manage vast territories, and raise 4 sons who would become Khans themselves, including Mungke Khan and Kublai Khan. Sorkoktani's story illustrates the brutal effectiveness of Genghis Khan's method. By empowering capable women from conquered peoples, he created a network of leaders who were personally invested in Mongol success and who possessed intimate knowledge of the societies they now helped govern. These women became bridges between the Mongol elite and local populations, making resistance not just difficult but often pointless. Do you think there's a difference between empowering people for strategic advantage and empowering them for moral reasons? And does the motivation matter if the outcome is the same? The method extended beyond individual appointments to systematic policy changes that revolutionized how women functioned within the empire. Genghis Khan established laws that protected women's property rights, allowed them to participate in trade, and even granted them authority in military logistics and intelligence gathering. These weren't progressive policies in the modern sense. They were pragmatic recognitions that women's capabilities were too valuable to waste. The intelligence network that Mongol women created became one of the empire's most formidable weapons. Women could travel with less suspicion, gather information in domestic settings that were closed to men, and communicate across tribal and cultural boundaries in ways that male spies couldn't replicate. The brutal effectiveness of this approach was that it turned traditional gender roles into strategic advantages rather than limitations. But perhaps the most brutal aspect of Genghis Khan's method was how it psychologically transformed conquered societies from within. When women who had been powerless under previous regimes suddenly found themselves with authority, influence, and protection under Mongol rule, they became the most effective advocates for Mongol superiority. They didn't just accept conquest, they embraced it because it offered them opportunities that their own societies had denied them. This created a psychological dynamic that was more devastating than any military defeat. Conquered peoples began to see Mongol rule not as foreign oppression, but as liberation from their own restrictive traditions. Women in particular became agents of cultural transformation, slowly but systematically changing how their own communities thought about power, merit, and social organization. The brutality wasn't in violence, it was in the complete transformation of conquered societies' value systems. Genghis Khan understood that you could control people's bodies with armies, but you could only control their minds by offering them something better than what they had before. For women in medieval societies, Mongol rule often was genuinely better, and that made them willing collaborators in their own cultural conquest. The method also extended to marriage and family alliances, but not in the way most people imagine. Rather than simply taking wives from conquered peoples as symbols of dominance, Genghis Khan created a sophisticated system of strategic marriages that elevated women from conquered tribes to positions of real influence. These marriages weren't just diplomatic gestures. They were mechanisms for integrating the most capable women from conquered societies into the Mongol power structure. The wives and daughters of Mongol leaders became administrators, negotiators, and cultural ambassadors. They maintained connections with their birth communities while gaining access to Mongol resources and authority. This created a network of women who spanned the entire empire and who had personal relationships that transcended ethnic and tribal boundaries. The result was an empire that was held together not just by military might, but by a web of relationships, loyalties, and mutual interests that centered significantly on empowered women. These women had reasons to support Mongol rule that went beyond fear. They had personal stake in its success and continued expansion. But the most sophisticated aspect of Genghis Khan's method was how it addressed the practical challenges of governing such a vast empire. Traditional empires struggled with communication across distances, cultural integration of diverse peoples, and maintaining loyalty across generations. Genghis Khan's network of empowered women provided solutions to all of these challenges. Women who had been elevated from conquered societies became cultural interpreters, helping Mongol administrators understand local customs, resolve disputes, and implement policies in ways that minimized resistance. They became communication channels that could carry information and instructions across vast distances more effectively than formal diplomatic networks. Most importantly, they became invested in passing pro-Mongol attitudes to the next generation. The children raised by these empowered women grew up seeing Mongol rule not as foreign occupation, but as the natural order of things. They were taught to value merit over birth, to respect diverse religious and cultural practices, and to see the empire as a system that offered opportunities for advancement regardless of ethnic background. This generational transformation was perhaps the most brutal and effective aspect of the entire method. Have you ever considered how changing who holds power in a society can transform that society's entire value system within a single generation? The long-term impact of this strategy becomes clear when we examine how the Mongol Empire differed from other great empires in history. Most empires were held together by force and collapsed when that force was withdrawn or weakened. The Mongol Empire, despite its reputation for brutality, actually created systems of governance that outlasted the military might that created them. The trade networks, legal systems, cultural exchanges, and administrative structures that emerged from Mongol rule persisted long after Mongol political control ended. This wasn't accidental. It was the result of creating stakeholders at every level of society who had personal reasons to maintain and develop these systems. Women who had been empowered under Mongol rule became the guardians and transmitters of these innovations. Consider the impact on trade and commerce. Women in many societies had always been involved in local trade, but Mongol policies systematically expanded these roles, creating female merchants, administrators, and financial managers who operated across vast distances. These women developed commercial networks that spanned continents and that continued to function long after the political unity of the empire had dissolved. The Silk Road, often described as the greatest trade network in human history, wasn't just a Mongol creation. It was maintained and operated significantly by the network of empowered women who had personal and economic interests in keeping those trade routes open and profitable. The brutal effectiveness of Genghis Khan's method was that it created systems that were self-sustaining because they served the interests of those who operated them. The method also transformed religious and cultural practices across the empire. Rather than imposing Mongol religious beliefs on conquered peoples, Genghis Khan's approach was to identify and empower women who were keepers of local religious and cultural traditions. This served multiple purposes. It preserved cultural knowledge that might otherwise have been lost. It prevented religious resistance to Mongol rule, and it created a synthesis of traditions that enriched the empire as a whole. Women who had been marginalized in traditional religious hierarchies suddenly found themselves with authority to practice, teach, and even adapt their spiritual traditions. This created a flowering of religious and philosophical exchange that was unprecedented in scope and sophistication. The brutal irony was that conquest led to greater religious freedom and cultural preservation than many societies had experienced under their own traditional rulers. But perhaps the most profound aspect of Genghis Khan's method was how it demonstrated the potential of human resources that were being systematically wasted by other societies. By empowering women who had been suppressed, by elevating capability over birth status, and by creating systems based on merit rather than tradition, the Mongol Empire accessed human potential that its competitors couldn't even see. This wasn't just about women. It was about recognizing and utilizing all forms of human capability regardless of their traditional social status. The Mongol Empire became a magnet for capable people from all backgrounds because it offered opportunities for advancement that were available nowhere else in the medieval world. The brutality of the method lies in its demonstration that most societies were voluntarily limiting their own potential by maintaining systems that suppressed capable people based on accident of birth or gender. When Genghis Khan offered alternatives to these systems, the response was often enthusiastic collaboration rather than resistance. The modern implications of understanding Genghis Khan's method are profound and uncomfortable. We like to think of historical progress as a gradual evolution toward more enlightened systems, but the Mongol example suggests that revolutionary progress is possible when leaders have the vision and courage to recognize and empower previously marginalized capabilities. The uncomfortable truth is that many modern organizations and societies are probably making the same mistakes that Genghis Khan's enemies made, systematically wasting human potential by maintaining traditional hierarchies that prevent capable people from contributing at their highest level. The difference is that we no longer have the excuse of ignorance. We have historical examples of what becomes possible when these limitations are removed. What would happen in your organization or community if leadership positions were determined purely by demonstrated capability, rather than by traditional qualifications or social connections? The story of Genghis Khan's method forces us to confront questions about power, merit, and social organization that are as relevant today as they were 800 years ago. How much human potential are we wasting by maintaining systems that limit opportunities based on irrelevant characteristics? How many innovations, solutions, and breakthroughs are we missing because we haven't learned to recognize and empower capability wherever it exists? The brutal effectiveness of Genghis Khan's approach wasn't just in its military applications. It was in its demonstration that societies that learn to maximize human potential will consistently outcompete societies that don't, regardless of other advantages they might possess. As we conclude this exploration of one of history's most successful empire-building strategies, it's worth reflecting on the paradox it presents. The man remembered as one of history's most ruthless conquerors was also one of its most effective promoters of social mobility and gender empowerment. The methods that seemed brutal to his enemies were often experienced as liberation by those who benefited from them. This doesn't excuse or justify the violence and suffering that accompanied Mongol conquest, but it does force us to think more sophisticatedly about historical leadership, social change, and the relationship between power and progress. Sometimes the most brutal truth is that revolutionary progress requires revolutionary methods, and revolutionary methods often challenge everything that established powers consider sacred or unchangeable. The legacy of Genghis Khan's method lives on in every organization that prioritizes capability over credentials, in every society that provides opportunities for advancement regardless of background, and in every leader who recognizes that true strength comes from empowering others rather than suppressing them. If this exploration of historical leadership and empowerment strategies has challenged your thinking about power, potential, and social organization, I encourage you to share your thoughts in the comments below. How do you think modern leaders could apply these insights ethically and effectively? And please, if this content has given you new perspectives on leadership, history, and human potential, don't forget to like this video and subscribe to the channel. By sharing these important historical lessons, we can continue learning from the past to build better systems for the future. Genghis Khan's brutal method wasn't just about building an empire. It was about recognizing and unleashing human potential that had been systematically suppressed by traditional social structures. The true brutality wasn't in the conquest itself, but in how effectively it demonstrated that most societies were voluntarily limiting their own capabilities. The question for us today isn't whether we should emulate Genghis Khan's specific methods, but whether we have the wisdom and courage to learn from his insights about human potential and apply them in ways that serve justice, progress, and the flourishing of all people. Because at the end of the day, the most brutal truth of all might be that we're still making many of the same mistakes that Genghis Khan's enemies made, and we're paying the same price in wasted potential and missed opportunities for revolutionary progress.